This is the story of the day the United States Army Air Forces almost bled to death in broad daylight. August 17, 1943. 376 B-17 flying fortresses took off from England on a mission that would decide whether American precision daylight bombing was brilliant strategy or suicidal arrogance. The targets were Regensburg and Schweinfurt, deep in southern Germany, 430 miles from the nearest friendly fighter base. For 6 of the 8 hours over enemy territory, the bombers would be completely alone. The Luftwaffe had been waiting 3 years for this moment. The British, who had already tried daylight bombing and lost half their aircraft in single missions, watched in polite silence. They knew what was coming. The Americans were about to learn it the hard way. 60 bombers and 600 young men never came home. This is what really happened when doctrine met reality at 25,000 feet. Lock in. This is wartime zone. The idea was born in the 1930s inside a squat, red brick classroom building at Maxwell Field, Alabama, where the ceiling fans moved hot, humid air around like slow paddles, and the blackboards were always covered with chalk diagrams of smokestacks, rail yards, and power grids. A small, intense circle of instructors and students, men whose names would later be carved into Air Force history, spent years dissecting the industrial anatomy of modern nations the way medical students dissect cadavers. Major Harold George, Captain Haywood Hansel, Major Kenneth Walker, Captain Lawrence Cuter, and a dozen others pored over factory blueprints, production tables, and tonnage reports until they could recite them like scripture. They reached the same conclusion again and again. A 20th century war machine was not an army in the field, it was a web of precision parts. Cut the flow of ball bearings and every tank, truck, and aircraft in the Wehrmacht would eventually grind to a halt. Destroy the synthetic oil plants and the Luftwaffe would run out of aviation spirit. Knock out the Möhne and Etter dams and the Ruhr steel mills would drown. Do it accurately enough, and the enemy would be paralyzed long before a single American soldier had to storm a beach. No massive armies. No million casualty offensives. Just fleets of high-altitude bombers flying in daylight, guided by the revolutionary Norden bomb sight, a mechanical marvel so secret it was carried onto aircraft in a locked box and guarded by an armed sergeant. The bombardier would peer through its telescope, make tiny corrections with gyro-stabilized precision, and release his load directly into the target's vitals from 4 miles up. The sales pitch was intoxicating. A skilled bombardier could, in theory, drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet. In practice it was nowhere near that good, but it was still orders of magnitude better than anything the British or Germans had. The bombers themselves, the B-17 and the coming B-24, were designed from the keel up for this doctrine. 4 engines for redundancy, heavy armor plate around crew compartments, and 13.50 caliber machine guns that, when flown in tight, staggered formations called combat boxes, would supposedly create a wall of lead no fighter pilot could penetrate. The Air Corps Tactical School called it the self-defending daylight formation. Critics called it wishful thinking. The instructors called it destiny. There was only one flaw. No one had ever tried it against a first-rate Air Force that knew it was coming. The British had tried. On the morning of December 14, 1939, 24 Vickers Wellington bombers took off in broad daylight to attack German warships anchored off Wilhelmshaven. They flew in loose Vic formations, unescorted, confident in their front and rear-powered turrets. By the time they limped home, if they limped home, 12 were gone, shot down by Me-109s and Me-110s that attacked with impunity. 4 days later, on December 18th, another 22 Wellingtons tried the same thing. 12 were lost. 50% casualties in a single afternoon. The mathematics were merciless. At that rate, Bomber Command would be wiped out in a week. By the summer of 1940, the RAF had abandoned daylight operations almost entirely. The few raids that continued were small, low-level, and usually suicidal. The lesson was written in burning fabric and the bodies of young men floating in the North Sea. Unescorted daylight bombing over a defended target was not war, it was mass suicide. Into the vacuum stepped Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Harris in February 1942. Bomber Harris was a tall, blunt, profane man who believed precision bombing was a dangerous delusion. He had seen the early raids. He had read the loss reports. He had no intention of repeating the mistake. Under Harris, Bomber Command became a nighttime force of 4-engine heavies, Sterlings, Halifaxes, and above all Lancasters, that flew in loose streams under cover of darkness and dropped their loads over entire cities. If you couldn't hit a single factory, Harris reasoned, you could at least hit the city that contained the factory. Area bombing, or as he preferred, dehousing, became the new doctrine. Hamburg in July 1943 was turned into a firestorm that killed 40,000 civilians in a single week. Cologne, Essen, Dusseldorf, and eventually Dresden followed. Harris was brutal, effective, and utterly convinced the Americans were marching toward the same slaughter the RAF had barely survived in 1940. The Americans refused to listen for three reasons that had almost nothing to do with military logic and everything to do with politics and identity. First, Franklin Roosevelt wanted daylight bombing. American voters needed to see their boys in action in newsreels and newspaper photos. Sunlit formations of silver fortresses against blue European skies looked heroic in a way that anonymous night raids over blacked-out Germany never could. Second, Congress needed proof that air power alone could win wars. The Army and Navy were already fighting for budget dollars. If the Army Air Forces could demonstrate that strategic bombing could knock Germany out without a bloody ground campaign, the case for an independent Air Force after the war became irresistible. Third, and most important, the young United States Army Air Forces had staked its entire institutional soul on daylight precision. If bombers required long-range fighter escort all the way to Berlin and back, then the dream of the self-defending heavy bomber collapsed, and with it the central argument for air power independence. The B-17 Flying Fortress became more than an airplane. It became a sacrament. 10 men, 13 guns, 4 Wright Cyclone engines, and a Norden bomb sight in the nose. The fortress, the theorists insisted, could fight its way to any target on Earth and fight its way home again. To admit otherwise was heresy. By the summer of 1943, the 8th Air Force in England had grown large enough to put the doctrine to the ultimate test. Bases sprouted like mushrooms across East Anglia, hardstands, Nissen huts, control towers, bomb dumps. Young men who had never been farther than Chicago or Tulsa suddenly found themselves drinking warm beer in English pubs and writing letters home they hoped would arrive before the telegrams. And at the center of it all stood Colonel Curtis Emerson LeMay, 36 years old, already balding, already chewing an unlit cigar like it had personally offended him. LeMay had taken command of the 305th Bomb Group in October 1942 and turned it into the most disciplined outfit in the 8th. He believed, really believed, that if every bomber flew exactly where it was supposed to fly, wingtip to wingtip, the combined firepower of the combat box would be impenetrable. He drilled his pilots until they could hold position within 10 feet at 200 miles an hour in turbulence and flak. He flew missions himself to see what the formations looked like from the inside. He became the high priest of formation discipline. Any pilot who straggled, who opened a gap the fighters could exploit, answered to LeMay personally, and LeMay's displeasure was legendary. The rest of the 8th Air Force studied the 305th the way theology students study scripture. The combat box became official doctrine. The stage was set. What nobody in those Alabama classrooms had ever seriously wargamed was what happened when the enemy refused to cooperate. When the enemy had 3 years to study your doctrine, to build radar chains, to train fighter pilots who lived for the moment the silver formations appeared on their scopes. When the enemy realized that head-on attacks at maximum speed neutralized most of your defensive fire and turned your proud cathedral of a bomber into a very expensive coffin. That moment arrived on August 17, 1943 over Regensburg and Schweinfurt. But that is another story. The doctrine was about to be stress-tested to destruction. The plan for August 17, 1943 was the most ambitious heavy bomber operation the world had ever seen, and it carried the fingerprints of men who believed they could outthink the enemy with pure geometry. 146 B-17s of the newly formed 4th Bomb Wing, led by Colonel Curtis LeMay himself, would strike the Messerschmitt Bf-109 factories at Regensburg-Prüfening in southern Germany. Instead of turning north for the long haul home, they would continue south across the Alps and land at newly captured Allied airfields in North Africa. The trick was elegant. The Luftwaffe fighters that mauled them on the way in would be forced to land for fuel and ammunition. By the time they were ready for a second attack, the bombers would already be over the Mediterranean and untouchable. Meanwhile, 2 hours later, 230 more fortresses of the 1st Bomb Wing would hit the 5 great ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt. German fighter command would be forced to choose which force to engage, splitting their strength and giving each bomber stream a fighting chance. On paper it looked brilliant. In the briefing huts it sounded like victory. In the sky it would become a slaughter. Then the English weather, that ancient and impartial enemy, intervened. A solid deck of cloud rolled in over East Anglia just as the Schweinfurt force was taxiing. Visibility dropped to a few hundred yards. Takeoffs in those conditions were suicidal. One B-17 had already nosed over into the mud the week before during a similar delay. The 1st Bomb Wing was grounded for 3 critical hours. Instead of staggered attacks that would force the Luftwaffe to divide its fighters across time and space, both streams now arrived over the continent within 90 minutes of each other. The German fighter controllers, listening to their Freya and Würzburg radars, must have laughed out loud. It was Christmas in August. Takeoff began at first light anyway. The Regensburg force rolled first because LeMay refused to wait. From 15 different bases the big radials coughed blue smoke, caught, then settled into the familiar shaking roar. One by one the fortresses lumbered down perforated steel planking runways, lifted ponderously, and began the long climbing circle to assembly altitude. Crews wore bulky electrically heated bunny suits that smelled of rubber and fierce sweat. Wires ran from the suits to sockets in the fuselage. When the plugs shorted, and they always did, the temperature inside the airplane dropped to 40 below zero in minutes. Oxygen masks froze to faces. Frostbite blackened noses and fingers in an hour. Men urinated into relief tubes that iced solid, or simply into their flight boots because there was nowhere else to go on an 8 or 10 hour mission. They flew knowing the actuarial tables by heart. 1 chance in 4 of finishing a 25 mission tour. 3 chances in 4 of dying, bailing out over Germany, or rotting in a stalag until the war ended or you did. Over the North Sea the formations tightened into the combat boxes LeMay had drilled into them for a year. 18 ships per group, 3 groups per wing, stacked high, low, and level in echelons so that every one of the more than 200.50 caliber guns could bear on any point in the sky. From the ground they looked invincible, a glittering lattice of aluminum and perspex stretching for miles. From inside they felt like flying coffins, thin skin for engines that could be set on fire by a single 20mm round, 10 men trapped in a narrow tube with no parachutes handy and no way to maneuver. The first German fighters appeared at 9:30 over the Dutch coast, little black specks that grew impossibly fast. Then more. Then hundreds. The Luftwaffe had stripped every Jägerschwader from France to Norway. Entire Gruppen were pulled from the Russian front for the day. Radar stations along the coast fed perfect vectors to the controllers at Delen and Leeuwarden, who spoke calm, precise German, moving squadrons the way chess masters move knights and bishops. The attacks were textbook, perfected over 3 years of watching British and now American bombers bleed. Head-on passes from 12 o'clock high, closing speed 550 miles an hour. The German pilots opened fire at 800, sometimes 1,000 yards, well outside the accurate range of the American 50s, poured a 2-second burst of 20mm and 30mm cannon shells into the cockpit or engines, then rolled inverted and dove beneath the formation before the gunners could traverse. One burst into the cockpit and both pilots were dead before the blood had time to freeze. The fortress would fly on straight and level for 5, 10, 15 seconds, an eternity, then gently roll over and fall, taking 10 men with it. Radio discipline, drilled into them for months, collapsed in the first 10 minutes. Bandits 12 o'clock high, here they come, here they come. Break left, he's on your tail, Jesus he's close. Number 2's on fire, we're going down, we're static. Parachutes, I see 6, 7, oh god the whole crew's out, they're not gonna make it. Waist gunners fired until the twin barrels glowed cherry red and the gloves smoked. Top turret gunners stood on their seats to keep the guns tracking. Ball turret gunners hung upside down in their plastic bubbles, spinning like madmen, firing at fighters that flashed past so fast the tracers looked like solid lines. Spent brass poured out of ejection chutes and golden waterfalls, piling ankle-deep on the catwalks. Some fighters exploded, a 190 took a direct hit from a tail gunner and simply disintegrated, the pilot never had time to bail out. But there were always more. Twin-engine Me-110s and Ju-88s hung off at 1,000 yards and loose salvos of 210mm Warfare granite rockets, unguided, terrifyingly accurate in mass. One rocket hit a low squadron box and 3 fortresses vanished in a single orange bloom. Focke-Wulf 190s came in from 6 o'clock low, raking the unprotected bellies where the armor was thinnest and the bomb bay full of high explosives waited for a spark. The sky filled with horror. Burning aircraft fell trailing black smoke and pieces of men. Parachutes opened too low and drifted into the North Sea. Some crews bailed out over land and were beaten or lynched by civilians before the Wehrmacht could intervene. Others rode their ships all the way in, refusing to abandon wounded crewmates. One B-17 was seen flying straight and level with both pilots dead. The co-pilot's body slumped over the yoke, until it simply stalled and spun in. The fighters circled like sharks, finishing off the stragglers with casual bursts the way a man swats flies. Over the target the flak was waiting, black puffs that looked soft from a distance but threw jagged steel in every direction. Bomb bay doors opened. The Norden bomb sights whirred and clicked. Bombardiers made final corrections with gloved fingers numb from cold. Bombs away. The planes leaped upward as 5 tons of high explosive fell away. Regensburg's Messerschmitt complex disappeared under a moving carpet of 1,000-pounders. Reconnaissance photos would later show 80% of the main assembly halls destroyed. 1/3 of Germany's fighter production gone in 8 minutes. But the price was already being paid in blood and aluminum all the way from the Dutch coast to the Alps. Colonel Curtis LeMay flew in the right seat of the lead ship of the entire Regensburg force, a brand new B-17F named Princess O'Rourke. He never touched the yoke. The aircraft commander, Major Louis Lyle, did the flying. LeMay simply sat there, cigar unlit because oxygen and open flame do not mix, eyes narrowed against the glare, watching the formation the way a sheepdog watches for the first sign of straying. Every time a wingman began to sag behind the power curve or drift out of position, LeMay keyed the mic and spoke 2 sentences in the same flat, Midwestern voice he used to order coffee. "Close it up, damn you. Close it up." No shouting, no drama. Just those 6 words delivered like a death sentence. Pilots who heard them in their earphones felt their stomachs knot. They closed it up. Men who flew with LeMay that day carried the memory of that voice for the rest of their lives. Some heard it in nightmares 50 years later. At 10:51, the bomb bay doors of 146 fortresses yawned open almost simultaneously over Regensburg profaning. For 8 solid minutes the sky rained 1,500-pound high-explosive bombs in a perfect moving carpet. Reconnaissance Spitfires flying high cover photographed the Messerschmitt complex before and after. The before pictures showed orderly rows of final assembly hangars, fuselage jigs and engine test cells. The after pictures showed a moonscape of shattered concrete, twisted steel and burning buildings. 80% of the main production facilities were destroyed or heavily damaged. 1/3 of Germany's entire single-engine fighter output for the next several months was wiped out in the time it takes to hard-boil an egg. Albert Speer himself would later write that the Regensburg raid set Me-109 production back by at least 2 months and forced the dispersal of the entire program into forests and small towns that were never fully efficient again. Then the formation turned south. Engines were already coughing blood, oil pressure dropping, cylinders running hot, superchargers shredded by flak fragments. Gasoline streamed from ruptured wing tanks like silver banners. Crews threw everything overboard that wasn't nailed down, machine guns, radio sets, even the ball turret on one ship, to save weight and fuel. They crossed the Alps with peaks clawing at their bellies, pilots hand-flying on 2 engines, navigators praying the winds aloft tables were right. Over the Mediterranean the stragglers began to drop behind. One fortress simply lowered its nose and flew straight into the sea rather than ditch with wounded aboard. 24 aircraft never reached North Africa. Dozens more limped into Bone, Talergma and Biskra trailing smoke, hydraulic fluid and blood. One landed with both pilots dead at the controls, the co-pilot's body still slumped over the yoke, the autopilot holding altitude until the fuel ran out. Back north, the Schweinfurt force flew straight into the second act of the tragedy. Because of the 3-hour delay, the Luftwaffe had landed its first wave, refueled, rearmed, and launched again with fresh pilots and full magazines. The fighters rose to meet the first bomb wing like hornets from a kicked nest. The sky over Schweinfurt became a single continuous explosion of cannon fire, tracer, and burning aluminum. The 100th Bomb Group, already nicknamed the Bloody 100 for earlier losses, went in with 21 ships and came out with 12. The 305th Bomb Group, LeMay's old command, took off with 16 and landed 3. When the survivors straggled back to England that night, the runways looked like a salvage yard after a tornado. Wings looked like lace doilies. Engines hung feathered and dead. One fortress landed with a hole in the fuselage big enough to drive a jeep through. The waist gunner was still at his guns, frozen solid, hands welded to the triggers. Crews stumbled down the ladders covered in blood that was not always their own. Some simply sat on the grass and cried without sound. The final accounting was read the next morning in a stunned operations hut. 60 B-17s shot down outright, 7 written off as scrap, 5 interned in Switzerland or Sweden. Over 600 men dead or missing, another 50 wounded. 18% of the force gone in a single day. At that rate the entire 8th Air Force would cease to exist in 6 more missions. That evening in the officers' mess at Thorpe Abbot's, a British group captain raised a pint of warm beer and said very quietly, "Well, gentlemen, how was your day at the office?" An American captain stood up, threw his glass against the stone fireplace so hard it shattered into dust, and walked out into the rain without a coat. 7 weeks later, on October 14, 1943, the 8th went back to Schweinfurt. This time there were no clever diversions, no North African shuttle, no tricks at all. Just 291 fortresses flying straight into the teeth of everything the Luftwaffe still possessed. The German fighter controllers had learned. They massed over 300 fighters and hit the bombers continuously from the Dutch coast to the target and all the way home. 60 more fortresses went down. 17 more were scrapped on landing. Another 200 crewmen were added to the missing list. 20% losses in a single mission. The day became known as Black Thursday. After that, deep penetration raids without escort were quietly suspended. The doctrine was bleeding out on the concrete of English airfields, one empty parking revetment at a time. Yet something strange and terrible began to happen beneath the numbers. Regensburg never fully recovered. Messerschmitt fighter production was scattered into forests, barns, even Autobahn sections, and never again reached pre-August levels. Schweinfurt's ball-bearing output dropped 34% after the first raid and never returned to full capacity. The Germans were forced to beg neutrals like Sweden for supplies and to redesign entire weapon systems around shortages. Factories began moving underground, caves, salt mines, beer cellars. Billions of Reichsmarks that could have built Panthers or new U-boats were poured into concrete bunkers and dispersal sites. 1 million workers who should have been making shells on the Eastern Front were instead clearing rubble in German cities. The Luftwaffe's best squadrons, men who could have been strafing Russians at Kursk or escorting bombers over Sicily, were chained to the defense of the Reich. The bombing was working, just not in the clean, surgical way the Alabama theorists had drawn on blackboards. It was working the way a sledgehammer works, slow, ugly, and expensive. The price was measured in the small, intimate currencies of war. Empty bunks in the barracks that no one spoke about. A pair of flying boots left neatly under a cot because the owner would not be coming back for them. Memorial services every Sunday morning where the chaplain's voice cracked on the same Bible verses week after week. Letters that began, "Dear Mom, by the time you read this." Telegrams delivered by Western Union boys in pressed uniforms who already knew what the yellow paper said before they rang the bell. Mothers in places like Des Moines and Schenectady and Mobile who opened the door and saw the chaplain and the telegram and simply folded to the porch without a sound. They died to prove that a theory written in chalk dust in Alabama could survive contact with the real world. And in the end, it did survive, barely, bloodily, and only because the men who flew those missions kept climbing into the airplanes even after the mathematics told them they were already dead. The turning point did not arrive with trumpets. It arrived in the form of 75-gallon pressed paper drop tanks stacked in pyramids beside English runways, and in the sleek silver shape of the P-51B Mustang rolling off the production line at Inglewood, California, and North American's Dallas plant. By December 1943, the tanks were finally flowing in quantity. P-47 Thunderbolts, once limited to escorting bombers only as far as Aachen, could now push to the Rhine and beyond. But the Real Revolution came in January 1944 when the first Mustang groups reached England. The P-51 was everything the Thunderbolt was not. 440 miles per hour at 30,000 feet, 6.50 caliber wing guns, and with two 75-gallon tanks, a combat radius that reached Berlin and back. Pilots who flew the early escort missions came back almost insulted at how easy it was. "It's like having a sports car after driving a truck," one wrote Captain Don Gentile of the 4th Fighter Group. "The Germans don't even want to play anymore." Then Jimmy Doolittle took command of the 8th Air Force on January 6, 1944. He was 57 years old, famous for the Tokyo raid, and utterly uninterested in half measures. On his first day he gathered the fighter commanders and issued the order that rewrote the air war in Europe. Forget close escort. Your job is not to babysit the bombers. Your job is to destroy the German fighter force in the air and on the ground. If you see a German airplane, shoot it down. If you see a German airfield, strafe it. Make them afraid to take off. The leash came off. Suddenly the sky belonged to the hunters. Mustang and Thunderbolt pilots flew fighter sweeps hours ahead of the bomber stream, pouncing on Luftwaffe aircraft as they climbed out of their bases. They strafing attacks tore up parked fighters, fuel bozers, and hangars. German pilots who had once dictated the terms of battle now found themselves bounced before they could form up. Experienced men, the ones with 100 missions, the ones who had survived 1943, began to die in droves. February 1944. 33% of the Luftwaffe's fighter pilots killed or wounded. March 1944. Worse. By April the kill ratios were grotesque. 4-1, 5-1, sometimes 10-1 in a single day. The Jagdwaffe bled out its veterans faster than the training schools could replace them. Boys with 50 hours total flight time, barely enough to solo, were thrown into BF-109s and FW-190s against Mustangs flown by Americans who had been in combat for a year and had 1,000 hours on type. It was murder, pure and simple. Bomber crews noticed the change almost immediately. In January 1944, a mission to Brunswick cost 45 heavy bombers. In May 1944, the same target cost 4. The sky was no longer a shooting gallery, it was a hunting ground. The doctrine had been right, but brutally incomplete. Daylight precision bombing worked. The dream born in Alabama classrooms could indeed destroy the arteries of German industry, but only if the bombers could reach the target. The men of 1943 had paid the butcher's bill to buy the time for the fighters to arrive. They bought it with 60 ships on August 17th, another 60 on Black Thursday, and hundreds more on the missions in between. They bought it with frostbitten hands, with frozen oxygen masks, with friends who simply never came back to the mess hall. Their sacrifice was not in vain, it was the down payment on victory. Curtis LeMay flew home from England in late 1944, promoted again, and took the same cold logic to the Pacific. There he replaced high explosive with incendiaries and burned 67 Japanese cities to the ground. He never lost sleep over it. If you're going to kill people, he said, kill them efficiently. Ira Eaker, the soft-spoken general who saved daylight bombing with a single page of paper at Casablanca, watched the final triumph from his headquarters in Italy. When the first Mustangs escorted bombers to Berlin in March 1944, he allowed himself one small smile and wrote in his diary, "We were right after all." He retired in 1947 as a lieutenant general, quietly proud, forever haunted by the boys who never came home to prove his point. Jimmy Doolittle lived long enough to see the United States Air Force become reality on September 18, 1947, independent at last because the bombers, and the fighters that finally arrived, had proven air power could be decisive. He died in 1993 at 96, still insisting the cost had been worth it. The cost was 26,000 American bomber crewmen killed in action, another 21,000 taken prisoner or forced to evade. RAF Bomber Command, fighting the night war at night, lost 55,573 aircrew, more than the entire British Army lost in the Battle of France and the Western Desert combined. Total Allied aircrew deaths exceeded the U.S. Marine Corps casualty list for the entire Pacific War. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, was blunt in captivity. The Allied bombing offensive forced us to divert 1/3 of our optical and electronics industry to air defense, 2 million workers to repair and dispersal, and the bulk of our day fighter force to the homeland. Without it, we could have doubled aircraft production in 1944 and kept the Panzer divisions mobile in 1945. The oil campaign of May-September 1944 reduced German fuel to a trickle. By early 1945, entire Luftwaffe Gruppen sat on the ground for lack of petrol while their pilots watched American bombers fly overhead unmolested. At the Cambridge American Cemetery in England, just outside the city, there is a long curved wall of the missing carries 5,127 names in white marble. Most belong to bomber crews who went down over Germany on days like August 17, 1943 and October 14, 1943. No known grave. Their families received a telegram, a folded flag, and silence. Those men, 19, 20, 21 years old, proved that a doctrine could work if the nation was willing to pay the price. And the nation paid. In full. Remember them. Honor them. Never forget what they paid so the rest of us could live free. This is Wartime Zone. We'll see you next day. Lock in.